Nearly 60 years ago, at President John F. Kennedy's landmark address at American University, just months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he spoke about the need for the world to recognize our shared humanity. He said, "Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, and we are all mortal." Greetings, everyone, to our special evening event this evening. My name is Frank Smith, and I'll be your moderator. On behalf of the Environmental Justice Team of First Church of Christ Longmeadow, United Church of Christ, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our friends and interfaith partners who share our concern about protecting our environment. Our interfaith partners who are co-sponsoring this event include Sinai Temple, and shout out if you're here from any of these partners. St. Andrew's Episcopal, Unitarian Universalist Society of Greater Springfield, Temple Beth El of Springfield, Islamic Center of Western Massachusetts, and St. Mary's Church of Longmeadow. I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items before I make introductions. First, please silence your cell phones. Bathrooms are located straight through the side door at the bottom of the stairs, right back there in the corner. There are 3 bathrooms. One is handicapped accessible and is marked accordingly. If needed, there is an elevator in the back of the room which will take you to the street level, so right back there in that little alcove. We are recording this event, and it will be televised after tonight on Longmeadow Community Television. Your presence here is taken as your agreement to allow us to record and televise the event, which may or may not reveal your participation. The evening will be divided into 3 parts and will mostly be a town hall style format. We will start with our speaker offering a brief synopsis of his book, All Hell Breaking Loose, followed by a couple of questions from me, and then we'll transition to members of the audience coming forward to the microphone and asking questions. We'd like to limit questions to 1 per person until everyone who would like to ask a question has had a chance to ask, at which point you may stand in line to approach the microphone to ask additional questions. Our speaker will focus on why ending the war in Ukraine is so important and why we need to reach an accommodation with China. I am pleased to announce that First Church has a new settled senior pastor. I am especially honored and privileged to introduce the Reverend Doug Bigsby. Reverend Doug will be visible in the area of Greater Longmeadow and Springfield. You won't be able to miss him. He quite literally stands out in a crowd. Reverend Doug will lead us in an opening prayer.
It's nice to welcome all of you as well. I'm glad to be here in the community and look forward to getting to know the interfaith community in this greater area of Springfield. Let us pray together. In the Hebrew Bible, Psalm 24, 1 through 2, it says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all with it. For he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters." God, our Creator, we give thanks for this night and for all the people and the faith communities represented here. Justice is an issue for all of us, and environmental injustice and global warming impacts all of our lives, especially the lives of the most vulnerable people in our world. Therefore, we especially pray for justice and fairness for those worst hit by our changing climate. We know people living in extreme poverty around the world are worst hit by the climate crisis and have done the least to contribute to it. They are also the fewest resources to implement change. We ask for your mercy, O Lord, and has led to the destruction of our common home. To stir our hearts into action as global temperatures increase, inspire us with ways we can make a difference in our nation, in our homes, and communities, and our faith communities. For your prompting, where we can do more to love our neighbor. We also pray for new levels of peace in our world around us. We pray for an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine. May the healing of these nations and all nations also lead us into the healing of our land and your creation. We give thanks for the work and scholarship of Michael T. Clare and pray that his voice is heard and that his book, All Hell Breaking Loose, will be a wake-up call to people in places of significant influence. Give us all wisdom and insight. Help us all to reject the kind of ignorance and consumerism and self-centeredness that is destroying our planet. Encourage us tonight in our interfaith struggle for justice, love, and peace. Teach us to discover the worth of each object and individual you have created. Help us to be filled with awe and contemplation as we work and walk on this planet. Help us to recognize that we are profoundly united with each other and others and all creation and our world as we journey toward healing, hope, and wholeness for our planet. We thank you for being with us each day and with all of our faith communities. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Doug. Before the pandemic, my wife Ann attended a World Affairs Council event in Springfield that featured a person who had a perspective on the environment from a point of view that we don't hear about. She came home with a copy of the speaker's book and said, "Frank, you have to read this book." The read was so compelling that it motivated me to concoct an idea to invite the author here to speak to us. I'd like to introduce Michael T. Clare. Michael didn't want me to drone on about his accomplishments, so I will just mention that he is Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security at Hampshire College and is a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Arms Control Committee in Washington, D.C. When I asked him how I should address him, he said, "Michael will be just fine." Michael is the author of several books and articles dealing with the defense establishment, the environment, and the need to end the war in the Ukraine. Please welcome Michael Clare. So let me start by the first question. Could you offer a recap of your book, All Hell Breaking Loose?
All right. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound working? You can hear me okay? Yes? So thank you all for coming out tonight. And thank you, Reverend Doug, for that inspiring message. I was very moved by your prayer. So thank you. We need to hear those words. And thank you, Frank, and your colleagues for bringing this together and for the support of the other faith communities that are represented here tonight. So I'm going to break down the recap into three separate questions. First, how did I get involved in this? Second, what did I learn? And third, why does it matter? So I have some notes, and I'll refer to them, but I'll try to summarize this. So how did I get involved? How did I get involved in this project? How was I motivated to study climate change and U.S. national security? So before this, I've spent decades really studying the causes of conflict. That was my task at the 5 colleges as a professor of peace and conflict studies. And I particularly studied the impact of resource competition on conflict. And I found that, and it's my belief that the struggle over scarce and diminishing resources like water and land, oil, copper, and other minerals are a major source of conflict, particularly in societies that are already divided along sectarian or racial lines and where resources are scarce, which is true in much of the world. And about a decade ago, I started examining what is the impact of climate change on these kinds of resource conflicts. And I discovered in the process that the Department of Defense was also investigating the same subject and was also concerned about the impact of climate change on resource scarcity and competition. And I was very interested to figure out why this was so. As early as 2008, this was the first time the intelligence community, the National Intelligence Council, released the first ever formal intelligence report on the national security implications of global climate change to 2030. And indicated that, or they suggested that this is the CIA and the other intelligence agencies said that climate change was very likely to increase strife in the kind of societies I described where resource competition was already a factor, and where climate change was likely to make these resources, especially water, increasingly scarce, and so push some societies over the edge into outright conflict. And this was followed in 2010 by a Defense Department report on more or less the same subject. And the Defense Department concluded that this was going to impact their missions, their tasks, their assignments, that increasingly societies around the world were going to be impacted by climate change, and it would increase resource competition and create more internal instability in societies, and this would inevitably lead to challenges for the military and they would be called upon to intervene in one way or the other. As the Defense Department reported in 2010, climate change will contribute to food and water scarcity and may spur or exacerbate mass migrations. While climate change alone does not cause conflict, it may act as an accelerant of instability or conflict around the world. This naturally piqued my interest. Why is the military studying these matters? And the answers to that question, I discovered, were quite surprising, at least to me. The Defense Department concluded that climate change posed a significant threat to its ability to carry out what they see as their primary mission. Now, I understand, ask anybody in the U.S. military today, any officer, they will say their primary mission is to defend the homeland and to address the threat posed by foreign enemies of the United States, especially Russia and China. They won't hesitate about that. But they will say that as climate change gathers momentum, it will interfere with their ability to carry out their duties. It will so intrude on their mission that it will itself pose a severe threat to national security. And I found that really quite surprising, because I hadn't heard that kind of talk coming from the military before. And they concluded also that the further they look into the future, the worse things were going to get, and at an exponential rate. that climate change would increase in severity, causing more chaos around the world, causing more threats to stability, calling on, creating demands for their services in one way or the other, and making it increasingly difficult to defend the nation. On top of that, they discovered that their own bases were at severe risk, especially naval bases on the coastlines, the west coast and the east coast, because of sea level rise and periodic flooding, which was going to get worse and worse, so that not only would they be called on to perform more and more emergency responses abroad, but their ability to do so was going to decline. So from this perspective, they concluded that climate change posed an existential threat to the United States. And I found this so alarming and this so important, but underreported, that I set out to write this book, All Hell Breaking Loose. So that's how I got into this. So the second question, what are my principal findings as a result of this? Now, to explain what my research methods were, I read every unclassified document available to me, and it turned out there's a lot of material that the Department of Defense and the intelligence community has released, and it's all cited in my book. I could help direct you to that. That wasn't being widely cited in the media, but is very revealing, as I said. I read a lot of government hearings, I attended hearings, I did a lot of interviews with officers. I myself spoke at all the war colleges and met with people in the military. And out of that, I fashioned my own summary or my own explanation of what they saw. And what I describe in my book is a new ladder of escalation, using the term from the Cold War of the nuclear ladder of escalation. And by the way, the nuclear ladder of escalation is very much back in the news because of risks in Ukraine, that conflict could trigger a nuclear response and a nuclear ladder of escalation, and in Taiwan, where a clash between the U.S. and China would very easily trigger the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear escalation. And we could talk about that later if you wish. But I use that term, that idea, to summarize what how the Pentagon viewed things looking deeper into the future, from the present into the future. So the earliest rungs of that ladder of escalation apply to the environment. Begin at the lowest level was the Department of Defense being called upon to conduct humanitarian rescue and emergency disaster relief. And that's already well underway, that first rung. For example, in 2017, when we had 3 hurricanes in a row, if you can remember this, Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria. The first one devastating Houston, Texas, the second one South Florida, and the third one Puerto Rico. To address the massive damage caused by those 3 hurricanes, Puerto Rico has never recovered from Maria, in fact. The Pentagon mobilized tens of thousands of troops and dozens of warships and hundreds of planes, a very large portion of its available force in the eastern United States. Meanwhile, California was on fire at the same time, and its bases there were at risk, and it had to deploy thousands of soldiers to put out fires in California. And that's the sort of future that they see happening increasingly in the future, where U.S. troops, instead of being available to fight foreign wars or defend us against enemies, will have to be protecting the United States itself from the effects of climate change. The second rung, which we've already also reached, is internal conflict in countries around the world due to fights over scarce resources like water, as I mentioned earlier. And this is happening all over Africa, especially the area called the Sahel, the area below the Sahara Desert, which is expanding because of climate change and desertification, causing the migratory peoples, who are mainly Arab and Muslim, forcing them to move south into areas that are mainly black African and often Christian or animist, causing fights in Niger, Nigeria, Mali, Somalia, Chad, the whole stretch of Africa. There are wars now underway over water. And very often the participants in these conflicts are drawn to terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And so the U.S. is currently involved in all of these countries, perhaps in small numbers, but nonetheless at significant risk, fighting counter-terror wars. And this is only going to increase. So that's the second rung. The third rung, which we haven't yet reached, but the Pentagon is very worried, is the collapse of what they call states of national security states of national security interest to the United States, their term. They don't specify, but if you read through the literature, you see they're especially talking about Pakistan, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the Philippines. These are countries that are on the edge right now because of climate change and are going to find it extremely difficult to hold their societies together in the future as conditions deteriorate, either through heat waves, extreme famine, or sea level rise, or some combination of all of those. And in the case of Pakistan, this is a particular worry because Pakistan has hundreds of nuclear weapons. There's a very real worry that in the case of the disintegration of Pakistan, those could fall into the hands of extremist elements. Right now, Pakistan is on the edge of chaos because of, on one hand, climate change. It's had the worst floods in modern history in the past year because of climate extremes, but also faces drought and famine in the future. And this stirs up all of these internal differences and disputes. And because of the risk of nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands, the Defense Department has been practicing for intervention in Pakistan, covert intervention to capture those nuclear weapons. And you can imagine that this is sort of kind of operation that could prove exceedingly dangerous and create a whole regional war. So that's the next stage that we haven't quite reached. The fourth rung up this ladder of escalation that they worry about is the collapse of global systems and institutions. This would occur, down the road a bit when states and institutions cannot cope any longer with mass migrations, with the collapse of global food supply systems, the collapse of global energy systems, and the inability of the international community to cooperate to address problems like this. We see with Ukraine What I'm talking about with, because of the fighting and the inability of the sides to find a way to move food. Ukraine is a major food supplier, as I'm sure most of you are aware, all of you are aware, major grain supplier to the rest of the world. At this point, we have a shortage of grain coinciding with severe climate effects in much of Africa and the Middle East, contributing to rising prices and instability throughout the region, like in Sudan, where there were food riots not so long ago. To what degree that's fueling what's happening in Sudan, I can't say. But you see what I mean when global systems start breaking down and the inability of the international community to address all of this. How this will affect the Department of Defense is unclear, but to give an example, right now NATO looks strong, but down the road before long, when Europe itself is subjected to extreme heat and drought, and much of its Mediterranean is turning into desert, the southern Mediterranean region of Europe, and you have massive migrations from Africa and the Middle East because of climate change. NATO is going to, European members of NATO are going to have more pressing issues than American priorities. This is the sort of breakdown that the Pentagon is worried about. And the fifth rung, I call all hell breaking loose, is all of that happening at a time when the United States itself is suffering from multiple extreme disasters, like what happened in 2017, but multiplied with many more such events happening simultaneously, and the U.S. military itself paralyzed by the destruction of its own bases. So this is my summary of the documentation, the speeches, the statements being made by the Department of Defense, military officials, intelligence officials, about what they see coming from climate change and why they see climate change as an existential threat to the United States. So finally, why is that important? Why do I think that's important? First of all, because I think it forces us to envision climate change in a different way, less about higher temperatures and the inconvenience that causes and the difficulties it causes, higher temperatures and stronger hurricanes, and understand that climate change is going to break down the systems, the institutions that have made America and the rest of the world able to prosper and live in peace for the most part for the past 50, 75 years. It's our global institutions that are most at risk, more than anything else, from climate change. And it's gonna, and with that breakdown will come chaos and violence. This is the perspective that this literature provides to us, and I think it's a terribly important that we see climate change in this way. I could talk more about this, but I'll stop there. But why else is that important? Because I think we have an impasse in our country in the debate about climate change. I don't have to tell you that there are many people in this country who think that the science of climate change is phony or fake news or is a hoax. And so me or anyone else, environmentalists, climate scientists, getting up and giving a speech about rising temperatures and rising sea levels is not going to convince those people. But we're not going to be able to make progress unless we have majority support, make progress in addressing climate change unless there is majoritarian support for progress on those issues. So we have to persuade some part of that population that now is resisting. They're not going to listen to environmentalists, but I think it's possible, it's conceivable that listening to generals and admirals and others with a military background who are putting it in, framing the issue as not an environmental problem, but as a national security problem about the safety of the United States of America might make a difference. And there's evidence to show that this argument makes a difference in Congress, where there's now a bipartisan group in Congress that supports legislation to address some of the features of climate change. So that's where I'll stop for now, to give you a sense of what my book is about, why I got into it, and why I think it's that what I learned is important. I'm sharing with you what I learned. You know, this is, I'm channeling what a lot of very smart people who care about this country have come to conclude. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me ask the first question. How can we best utilize our resources to affect positive change? After reading your book, I feel I am just a small pebble in a coming tsunami of crises.
Yeah, I don't think you're a small pebble. You're more than that. We're all more than that. So I was thinking how to answer you fairly, and I'm sure all of you are doing what you can individually or as families to address climate change by reducing your emissions, carbon emissions. That's what we all have to do, is reduce our carbon emissions, and that means using less fossil fuels in transportation and home heating and et cetera. And you all know that. I don't have to tell you that. You could do more. We all have to do more. But that's not enough. To influence, to make difference, we're going to have to act at the regional, national, and international level, and individuals can't do that by themselves. So we have to do so as communities and in different communities. So we are here tonight as faith communities, and faith communities have organized around this issue. This Longmeadow First Church is part of the Union of the United Church of Christ, and the UCC has something called the Council on Climate Justice, and maybe you could say more about that. We're trying to bring together UCC churches to act in concert, and other denominations that are represented here have like organizations who bring together people by faith to work together to make change. Each community has to work together. I know nothing about Longmeadow, but I live in Northampton, and we live in Western Massachusetts, and there are many efforts community-wide to make progress in reducing emissions by improving public transit is especially important, more green space. I think you know that. But really what we have to do is act at the national level. And President Biden has, as President Biden has said, to really make a difference this country has got to go on a path of substantially reduced carbon emissions. And that's big policy. And you need political support for that. I'm talking about, for example, we're going to have to install millions of electric car charging stations around the country. There's going to have to be one every mile on the Mass Pike, and so on, so that people can change. We're going to have to change to an all-electric transportation system. Everybody knows this. That's the only way we can overcome the dangers that I told you. Certainly the Department of Defense knows this, and they're moving to electrify their non-military vehicles, but you have to have charging stations. So you need political, you need the political will to make that happen. So the 2024 presidential and Senate elections are really going to make a difference. And my answer is, you know, I'm not here to favor any political candidates, but we have to be sure that there are people in power who are going to move on that agenda.
Okay, thank you. My next question, how can we balance helping Ukraine with all of the demands for oil, et cetera, with our world's need to lower fossil fuel consumption, especially now in the midst of the fight and so much damage that's been done and so many lives lost?
You know, it's hard to balance the different issues. One thing that's very clear is that Russia would not be in a position to do what it's doing if the rest of us weren't so goddamn dependent on Russian oil and gas. No question. Russia financed its military since 2014, when we saw what it was going to do. It was very clear what Putin had in mind since 2014, and Europe became more dependent on Russian oil and gas, as did the rest of the world, and still is. China and India buying more oil and gas, Russian oil and gas than ever. So you could, and it's the income from oil and gas that finances Putin's war machine. The two are like this. Russia is a petrostate, as we analysts describe it, like Saudi Arabia and Nigeria. It depends for government income on fossil fuel sales. So as long as we continue to be dependent on those fuels, Russia will thrive. And the only way to prevent Russia from thriving is to cut off our dependence on its fossil fuels. And that means cutting, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, period. Europe has come around to this notion, and it's going one step forward and one step back. No, that's unfair. It's going 1.5 steps forward and 1 step back. It's increasing its reliance on imported natural gas, a lot of it coming from the US, but they are investing a lot of money in green technology, much more than we are, much faster. So that's what has to happen. Yeah, we have to say that just as important as ending the fighting in Ukraine is to ensure that Russia's war income dries up through the elimination of dependence on Russian oil and gas. I hope that was clear.
Yes, that was clear. We just heard recently on the news that the population of India has surpassed that of China. How could reaching a carbon emissions agreement with China influence India's government to do the same? Is there past evidence that this strategy can work?
Well, you're playing into my hand. That's unfair. because I've written that in 2015, prior to the Paris Climate Summit, when the countries, nearly 200 countries signed the Paris Climate Agreement, which I think you're all familiar with. Leading up to that, President Obama, assisted very ably by our former Senator John Kerry, worked with China to get, with the Chinese leadership, to persuade them to agree to work together to get the climate agreement signed. And once they agreed, they then twisted one arm on one side and one arm on the other side of Prime Minister Modi of India to go along with it. If the US and China weren't cooperating, India wouldn't. So you need those two to agree. After that, after 2016 election, and Donald Trump became president, that cooperation came to an end. John Kerry was Secretary of State, and he was the figure responsible for managing this cooperative relationship between the U.S. and China on climate change cooperation. He lost his job, of course, and Trump banned that kind of cooperation with China. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has retained John Kerry, as an envoy, but is behaving in such a militarized way towards China. This is my view. I welcome discussion. That the Chinese have more or less stopped, are not cooperating with us on climate change. And they're the world's biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, so we need their cooperation. And if we can't get China's cooperation, India is going to go its own way, which is what's happening. So the progression, the way things look now, the way the scientists are projecting out is that we're not going to we're not going to be able to abide by the Paris Climate Agreement and to satisfy its overarching objective, which is to keep warming from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial level. It's almost assuredly going to go to at least 2 degrees Celsius increase, and probably at least to 2.5 degrees. Now, we've gone about 1.1 degree increase so far, and you can see what's happening now. Imagine doubling that or tripling that degree of severity as a consequence. Some things are not going to survive, like the Arctic ice cap and the Greenland ice sheet, and very likely the Antarctic ice sheet will not survive that much warming. Which means that Boston and New York City and Miami are history as viable cities, which means unless we can resume cooperation with China and then India to recommit to the Paris Agreement, we face a very dire future.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good news.
At this point, I'd like to transition to the third part of our presentation and invite you to come forward and ask any questions of Michael that you would like.
And don't be timid, you could ask me anything and disagree with me. Thank you.
I would like to hear your comments about solar power.
the mic on?
Oh. Yes, right on top on the front.
There you go.
I would like to hear your opinion on solar power. Should it be encouraged very, very strongly, or is it something that's on the sideline?
Solar power, the question was about solar power. Well, solar power is great. It's cheap. It can do anything. Why do you ask?
Go for it.
What is there, where is there doubt? There should be no doubt. Solar everywhere. Everywhere. The only question is, we need improved storage.
Right.
And that's a hurdle. That's a lot of research is going into how to find cheap storage. So, you know, and if the sun goes down at some point, and then it doesn't work. So you need to be able to store the electrical energy generated during the day by the sun so that you can use it at night. That's something that we should be able to solve. I will say this because I'm fascinated with resources. This creates new resource questions because in battery storage uses a lot of things like lithium and cobalt and other materials that are themselves scarce or currently are scarce. And was worried that there might be a conflict over those things the way there has been over oil. So we have to ensure that the whole solar process doesn't create new resource pools. But it can. Is there anything that I didn't explain? I mean,
Thank you.
we need more solar to power the electrical charging stations.
Right.
My question has to do with what the military is doing for research for increasing, or rather decreasing dependence on foreign oil. And I remember reading something about the Navy doing something to develop biofuels for the aircraft carriers. How is that coming along with the biofuels? And what are some of the other things the military is doing to help offset climate change?
So that's a good question. I have a chapter on that in my book.
I'll have to get the book then.
I mean, I did research that, and this is where Congress matters. Why I emphasize political action, because the Republicans in Congress have forbidden the Navy from proceeding along those lines. Yeah, they don't want the Navy to use alternatives to petroleum. Because for Republicans, petroleum is like holy water.
Yes, like they're almost.
Yeah. So what is the military doing? The problem is also for aircraft, which also burn up a lot of fossil fuels. The Air Force is testing alternative fuels made out of algae. You can create algae and manufacture diesel-like fuel, and they're testing that. They're testing other alternatives, but they're not there yet. So that's an area where a lot of investment has to go in research.
Yes, exactly. DARPA must have some
This
research
is not
on
a
that.
field that DARPA has shown any particular interest in. A lot of interest. That's not what they could. The services are. The Navy did a lot of it on this, but they were sort of frustrated by Republicans in Congress. And they couldn't hear voices because their issues. But the Army and the Marine Corps
suffered terribly. 1/4 of all the casualties in Afghanistan came from the poor soldiers guarding oil tankers carrying fuel from base to forward operating base, to troops in the field. 1/4 of casualties was to protect the end of this dangerous over. That's how horrible it is. Yeah. So the Army and the Marine Corps have been developing mobile solar arrays and mobile wind generators to reduce their need for fossil fuels in the field and to tighten their equipment and otherwise become increasingly self-sufficient, energy self-sufficient in the field, so they don't have to have oil convoys that are at risk. Okay.
Thank you for a very depressing talk. I thought you were giving us a glimmer of hope when you said that we could take a national security perspective and that would be potentially provide a more hopeful outcome. But it seemed to me that the conclusion of your talk is that the systems we have, governance systems and economic systems that we have not only in the United States but internationally, just are not up to the challenge. And that if that's the case, with the pace of climate change and its effects, it seems that it's even more depressing than you first implied.
So, do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is, do you see that the systems are really capable of making the adaptation to the challenge that climate change really presents? I mean, the Paris Accords aren't working. The political system in the United States doesn't seem to be up to the challenge. The Chinese, our relationship with the Chinese is such that doesn't look like they're going to be amenable to any accords on the climate. If you put it all together, it doesn't paint a very rosy picture.
No. I didn't come to bring false hope. and I think you're right in what you said. Things look more optimistic to me from 2010 to 2015. And then they went downhill. And I'm a little bit more hopeful now because the so-called Inflation Reduction Act does contain provisions for turning us in the right direction. But if we have a Republican Congress or a president in 2024, they will not be fulfilled, which is why, in answer to Frank's question, I said that is the ultimate task that all of us have, is to prevent that from happening. Now, if we have a Biden or somebody with his perspective as president in 2024 and a Democratic Senate and House, or close enough, then the provisions of that act could then give us hope. And I was still thinking, because that is a very important question. Then the president could go to China and say, we've done our part. Now you have to do yours. This is very complicated. I believe that the only way we can solve climate change and work World War III is to forge a climate change alliance with China.
Oh, I agree with that, but it doesn't look like our current policy is moving in that direction.
So we have to make that argument more and more. I think there's hope that more and more people get catch on to that.
I mean, in some ways, it seems like all the other issues that we face with China and with many other countries are irrelevant relative to the issue of climate change, but that somehow is not the first priority.
It is not at present. And in China, one thing that I've discovered in my recent research is China is more vulnerable to climate change than the U.S. is. And they've been suffering terribly. They had terrible heat waves this summer, flooding, drought, and I think that the Communist Party of China is going to be forced to either move on climate change or it's going to be pushed out of the way.
I'll let somebody else.
But everything you raised is important.
Thank you, Michael. This kind of follows up on what Richard was speaking about. I think we should probably send a copy of your book to every member of Congress. I think I think this position and this argument about national security is something that should be nonpartisan. And I know toward the end of your book, you mentioned that, well, your book was written during the Trump administration, I believe, and senior military officers were not feeling comfortable about speaking up on climate crisis issues, but they were exploring it and making plans anyway. But now that administration has changed, do you see any hope that the military will speak out more and feel more emboldened to address Congress on these issues from a national security standpoint so that something could happen?
They have been saying the right thing. The problem is, as the last questioner, I'm sorry, I didn't
Richard, yeah.
Richard said, right now Congress is possessed by demons.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It is an anti-China hysteria. I spent a month in Washington, and I hear from people who work in Congress, and they're out of their minds in demonizing China and voting every billion they can extract from us for more weapons for China. So the Pentagon does say that climate change is a concern, but that's not on the agenda of Congress.
We need to send them your book.
They're out of control.
Yeah.
There is, however, there are members of Congress who approach this not so much out of a climate change concern, but out of fear that our bases are at risk.
Right.
So the defense budget does include $5 billion. They're trifle, for the defense budget. But still, there's $5 billion in the defense budget for climate change resiliency for American military bases. So, and Congress is voting this, has voted this kind of money. So there is an understanding, at least, that if you're going to fight China, you're going to have to deal with climate change.
And the fact that our military is so stretched thin, if they're addressing all of these storms and fires, that they can't defend the homeland.
So that is, there are some Republicans who are beginning to, grasp that fundamental notion.
Good. Thank you.
That's the best hope I have to.
I have a little different question. Since one of your areas of expertise is natural resources spread around the world, in terms of food production, and I think food and climate change and population movement is big. In your research, did you come much about phosphorus? Phosphorus.
Yeah.
If phosphorus, I think 70% of the reserves are in South Sahara, and there's a lot of research on alternatives, and it's certainly overused in manure pits or contaminating water supplies. I would love to hear what you found out in your research.
That's about as much as I know.
Oh, okay.
That's not one that I follow.
It is not one that made the military.
Sahara, the Western Sahara is very interesting because it's claimed by Morocco as a independence nutrient there. Thank you though for bringing that up because we need to pay attention to every scarce resource.
Yeah, the devil's element in politics, but it is very important for food production.
That's it.
Yes, good evening. I would like to return to an earlier part of what you said, that we all know what we need to do individually and collectively through our faith congregations and come together to put pressure politically on institutions. And we have here in this Longmeadow, Springfield areas, everyone in this room knows, a big fight going on about preventing a gas pipeline, an opportunity to really come together to make a statement. And I'm sneaking in the question, I got a question here, but I'm sneaking in that I have a petition form here and we're having a rally next month. Downtown, a big rally, and folks ought to turn out and get information. But the question is, are you familiar with Paul Hawkins' work? He did a book, he's done two things. He did a book called Blessed Unrest. He'd been giving environmental talks around the country, and dozens of people would come up afterward and say what they're doing. And he said, there's a lot of this stuff going on, I'm going to count it, thinking he'd find tens of thousands. He said by the time he was done, he found globally between 1 and 2 million community-based projects of people mobilizing to do creative things, and that included political. And I think he says, at times when big systems are unstable, small efforts make a bigger difference. So I'm wondering if you have any sense of what kind of bottom-up change efforts or pressure on the political institutions are happening. What would be the status of that kind of effort? Because in addition to having to fight the big stuff at the top, there's a lot of stuff going on at the bottom that we don't see as much about because the media doesn't cover it in the same way.
Well, you mentioned pipelines, and I do know that there are pipelines being built all over the world and pipeline struggles everywhere around the world.
Right here in River City, too.
There you go. But I don't have a particularly wisdom on that topic. So I'm not sure I can help because I was so aware of the need for big changes that I'm not sure I can do justice to your question, which is a totally legitimate, important question. I'm not diminishing it in the least.
No, I understand that, sure. Okay, well, if you want to sign our petition, you can come to the back of the room. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your
wonderful lectures. I listened to it with great interest. I have a couple of, I think about 20 questions. I'm going to ask you the 17th one because I'm allowed to ask only one. My question is very simple. I was just reading another article on climate change, and it had this following line which I memorized. And the line was, we must reduce carbon emissions because our temperatures are already 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. Now, pre-industrial times is 1720 to 1900. Now, I, as an ordinary layperson, find it extremely difficult to get excited about a temperature increase of 1.2 degrees Celsius in a country which works in Fahrenheit on something which is above what happened in 1720. So my question is, how do we express all of this good stuff in language which makes sense to ordinary people, number one, and that is not by saying temperatures are more than 1.2. 1.2 degrees is I don't even know how to understand that. Now, simple language. Second thing is, how can that language show me what I can do as an individual which will actually make a perceptible difference somewhere? Not talking US military, not talking global policy, none of that is in my control. Not talking, Congress, me as an individual. If you say, well, turn the light off, yeah, sure, I know I will turn it off, but you know how much difference that makes. Final point, and you put your finger on it absolutely, how do you convince those who have it in their power to take the big decisions which will actually create an impact? Because this thing is beyond just you and me. This thing, somebody has to take big decisions, which in democratic countries means that you might not get elected, or you might get thrown out, because nobody wants to take the pain. I remember a survey where somebody said, are you willing to accept a tax which goes towards this? And people said, no. Conference like this, no problem, I'll come here, free cookies. But tax? Yeah, I mean, there is no charge, right? Absolutely. All right. But my final question to, look at this audience, beautiful people, average age 25 years. Where are those to whom this will actually make a difference?
So, I answered some of the questions already. I indicated that at 1.2 degrees Celsius increase, which is about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit.
Well, I'm Indian, I understand Celsius, don't worry.
Yeah, that we've already had a significant increase in extreme storm events, unlike what we've ever seen before, as I mentioned. And as I've mentioned, the Sahara Desert is expanding and creating chaos all over Africa. And I mentioned some of the consequences. As I said, if we go another degree Celsius, we're likely to see the melting of the Greenland ice cap and the Antarctic ice cap, meaning that we're going to get 6 to 10 or more feet sea level rise, which means if you live on any coastal area within 10 or 20 feet of sea level, which is a lot of Boston and Washington and Philadelphia and New York City, you're going to be flooded. It will become uninhabitable. Those are pretty clear images to people, and more people are beginning to feel those effects already and are aware of them. So that's the way you make this evident to people, is the effects they are going to personally experience.
Yes, I mean, what's the language to show that? Let me tell you, I'm from India. We just talked about India. And India is one of the big places which can make an impact, right? I can assure you that the vast majority of Indians will not understand his language. We simply don't understand his language. So what is the way of bringing this up to ordinary people in a way that people feel my house is on fire, which it is? You know, I mean, I'm not challenging you. I completely agree with everything you said. I've read a lot of stuff myself. But I'm just saying that This is a joint project, you, me, and all of us together. We need to find this language which excites people, which gets them up and say, look, I have to do something right now. Let's go. Do it. Do what? Right now we don't know do what. That's the question.
Yes, so I answered that question, and I'm happy to repeat it.
No, that's fine. No.
But I would posit to you that I know there's a lot of illiteracy in India, but that among literate people, I would posit that there's a very high awareness of the impact of climate change on India, because Modi is now talking about, because there's already extreme drought and water scarcity in Punjab and many other parts of the country. There's lots of suffering of farmers because they can't water their crops. And there's an broad understanding, I think, in the population that climate change is particularly threatening to India among the major powers. And Modi has said has announced all kinds of responses, Prime Minister Modi, that he's going to take. I don't believe him because I don't trust Modi, but nonetheless, he has acknowledged climate change poses a distinct threat to India's survival. And what he's calling for is it was turning India into the solar capital of the world. And that's not a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
And providing small-scale solar to isolated communities that can't get electricity from the grid, because the grid is powered by coal, as you know, and in India, and a lot of rural communities are not on the grid. So he is doing progress to deliver solar to isolated communities, and that's a step in the right direction.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all your investments.
Well, this may not be a good one, but I'll try. As I drive around, I look at roofs that don't have solar panels on them. I see some homes that do have solar panels that even don't face south, and still they're there, and I'm sure they're helping. How can we have solar really make a difference?
So this is public policy, and the answer is to give people a bonus in their taxes when they go solar. And when you do that, you'll see solar popping up on every house, which is the case in Europe. In Germany, the state buys back excess energy produced by solar. So you actually earn money. So when we do things like that, then you will see solar everywhere. And under the Biden Act, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is now, starting now, like just this week, you can get a huge discount on electric cars, which makes them affordable to people who couldn't afford them before. And you're going to see the same kind of tax credits and bonuses for putting up solar. That's what's going to do. That's why I emphasize the need for public policy changes. That's why you have to have members of Congress and the state legislature who are going to push these kinds of programs. Asking people to finance themselves is asking a lot. That's where, us good middle-class people can do that, but not everyone. But when everybody gets a tax break, then people will go. And that will, I think that will, if we have the right positions.
Hi. You know, I sit here and I've been listening, and I wonder what can a bunch of geriatrics, which is who you're speaking to, do? And one of the things that we always forget is that we always get letters around when we have politicians going for another term, and some of them have been around for far too many terms, but because everybody's heard the name for the last 35 or 40 years, they still vote for these people. And I wonder what they've done. And I think when those letters come, we should all call our local politicians and ask what they're going to do about this serious thing. They seem more interested in getting their face on television about some scandal or this didn't happen, it didn't happen this way, we didn't do this. I want to see what they are going to do when we call and we say, what are you going to do and how serious are you about doing it? And what are your colleagues going to do too? I mean, this is a democratic state, and except we have a lot of Republican governors, and they seem to be okay. So all Republicans can't be that bad. But I don't live in certain states, you know, I've just driven through them. But I think we as a group should take ourselves more when voting time comes around, because there's one thing that seniors do, we vote. And the other thing we do, we always throw a few bucks their way too. And we've been doing it for a long time. And I think we ought to think about doing that. Okay, thank you.
I don't think we should wait until election time, though.
Well, that's the only time they send us their phone number. That's the only time that they really send us a phone number where we can reach them.
I was interested in what you said before about how Congress people are listening to the talk about the bases needing to be fixed up. The bases that are being, the military bases. And that's, you know, you're not really talking directly about the big questions of climate change, but it's a very concrete thing that they can understand. And what the other gentleman said before about how it's so complicated to describe all the things that have to happen. I'm wondering if, since everyone in the world is having trouble talking to each other about getting anywhere with anything these days, if we could pick something that is directly related to climate change, like ending world hunger, for example, as a thing that nations and people could try to work on that is definitely necessary to all of our security. It's a humanitarian thing. Climate change is directly related to it with soil regeneration and with, you know, getting off phosphate fertilizers and using solar energy for agriculture and all the other things. I'm wondering if there might be some kind of hope in looking at something like that as tackling it, that the U.S. and China could certainly agree that ending world hunger would be something they could cooperate on, and you would get climate change benefits by doing something like that.
That's a very fair question. I think that's the sort of thing that we all have to sit around in a committee room and bounce that one around for a while. With you, I'm being fair with you about this, because I'm not sure that that's the way I would go, but there may be a good argument to be made for that. devastating to China and to us in similar ways that if we could get this is my, that if we could get a conversation going between U.S. and Chinese citizens, environmental groups, or cities, or, not governmental organizations, but non-governmental communications around our mutual vulnerability to climate change and the need for the governments to work together to solve climate change instead of making war with one another. That is my path that I'm advocating. Just so you know where I'm coming from. So your proposal makes sense to me, but it's the kind of thing that you want to have a longer discussion among people. What's the best way to go? And that could be very promising. Water, by the way, I'm sorry, what's your name? Cynthia. Cynthia. For many people in the world, it's water. That's the great worry. Where climate change is somewhat, food is a product of water. The ability to produce food is a product of water availability. And water, as the CIA noted back in 2008, water is the most vulnerable to climate change. Water scarcity or excessive flood, one or the other. But water might be a better path. Looks like you ran out of questions. I'm here. Thank you.
Just a quick question. One of the participants mentioned about throwing money, like at candidates. And I like to throw my money at foundations that I believe in. And I wondered if there are any in particular that you feel are particularly geared toward this issue.
Well, there is an organization in Washington called the Center for Climate and Security that is doing the work of getting former generals and admirals to talk to members of Congress about exactly what I was saying. And a lot of the information I presented to you comes from that organization. Their website is Climate and Security.
Climate. Okay.
And that's a great place to get information on everything that I've said. And they've actually had some success. I said that there have been some efforts in Congress to approve bipartisan efforts. And they're the group that spearheads those efforts.
So they could use my money? Thank you. Off.
Thank you. I had to turn mine off because there was feedback going from one mic to the other. The hour is at 9 o'clock, and so I think we're going to end the question and answer period at this point. And I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. I know sometimes it's a challenge after dinner to get in the car and go out again, but you're brave souls, and we thank you. And thank you, Michael, for coming here. I'm sure that we'll be hearing more on this issue and efforts for us to get together as an interfaith community and other friends to chart out a course that will yield some benefits and results.
Great.
Thank you very much.